That's a good question. I'd say, well, let's just put it this way. Agent Philip Ma is one of the most interesting agents in the world.
People hang on his every word, even the prepositions. He could disarm you with his looks or his hands. Either way. He can speak French in Russian. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis. Live from Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area, Philip Ma here with eXp Realty. I hope you enjoyed that opening video. Last weekend, I was showing houses to my client, Kirk, who's the person that you see at the beginning of the video. And I hired a videographer to follow us around and just capture a day in the life of a real estate agent. We were doing a bunch of different clips, and I asked Kirk, would you mind doing some humorous clips, parodies of taglines from TV commercials and movies that I like? And he said, sure. He was a really good sport. We filmed a few different clips, and this one from the Most Interesting Man in the World series of Dos Equis commercials was one of them. I hope it put a smile on your face. We really had a fun time doing the clips. Today, I want to cover the pros and cons of a non-contingent offer. This is a fairly common scenario that we have here in the Bay Area, especially under current market conditions with supply being low and demand being very high and increasing with the mortgage rates coming down. Last week, I helped a client write an offer on a house in Alameda County. It was a competitive multi-offer situation. We put together the offer, and one thing that you'll often see when it is a competitive situation is the listing agent will work with the seller to do a bunch of the inspections up front. And in this case, we had a general home inspection report, a roof inspection report, a pest control inspection report. Those were all provided up front in the disclosure package. In addition, they had the standard seller disclosures, the seller property questionnaire, the transfer disclosure report. So any issues that the seller knows about, they're required to disclose up front. We had all of those reports. We were able to review them. But at the same time, the purchase contract also has safeguards built into it, which we call the contingencies, so that the buyer has some period of time after ratifying the contract. If they agree on a price and terms with the seller, they have a period of time for certain contingencies. The loan contingency, if the buyer's getting a mortgage, they have some period of time to get their loan approved, to get an appraisal done, and of course, to do an investigation of the property. So those safeguards are kind of standard built in, and in my case, because we had all these reports up front, we knew the situation was going to be competitive, and my client was making an all cash offer. So we didn't have a loan contingency or an appraisal contingency. The only contingency of significance that we had in our offer was the investigation contingency. So I'll let me just kind of, I'm going to share here the purchase agreement. Bear with me 1 second. All right. So this is the California Residential Purchase Agreement, which is commonly used for making an offer. And it's pretty straightforward. You've got a purchase price, you've got a close of escrow period of time, and initial deposit. The contingency section is here in section L. And you can see here there's a loan contingency, appraisal contingency. In our case, we were paying all cash, so we checked no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency. We're going to be able to close fairly quickly. However, and you can see the investigation of property contingency, it defaults to 17 days unless you put in a different number in here. And what I put in here for our case was 3 days. And I kind of discussed this with my client. We decided that 3 days would be enough time just to get comfortable, to make sure that they didn't want to do additional inspections. They already had a home inspection, a roof inspection, and a pest control inspection done by the seller. But if they wanted to get a second opinion, or let's say they wanted to talk to the person who did the inspection, that's also a possibility. You could kind of see if there were any additional insight they could get from the inspector who did the actual inspection. So we had 3 days here for this investigation contingency, and a total of 7 days here, close of escrow. All right, so this is going to be a fast close, and we felt like we needed to have a fast closing date to be competitive. What happened? Well, the seller countered us along with, I think, one other buyer. So they countered us and one other party. But they also told us that they had a offer that was kind of the highest purchase price amount. We were below that. So they countered us at the higher purchase price amount, basically the highest offer that they had received. That offer had a loan contingency, so that buyer was getting a loan. So we were preferred because we were paying cash and had no loan contingency. However, they said in their counteroffer, you need to remove all contingencies. And we want a 5-day close of escrow. So instead of 7 days here, we want to close in 5 days. And down here, basically, this has to be 0 days. So no inspection contingency. And as it turned out, I of course, communicated this to my client, and we didn't really have a discussion around removing all of the contingencies because they were not willing to come up to the price that was in the counter offer. So we kind of stopped right there. They just didn't want to go above their offer price. Now, let's just say that they were agreeing to the higher price in the counter offer. What happens with removing all these contingencies? Well, this is where we can kind of get into the pros and cons of a non-contingent offer. The pro is you're in the game. You're competitive against other people who are making offers. So if this is a property that you really want, then you're in the game to get that property. What are the cons? Well, there's risk in removing all these contingencies. So let's talk about the best case scenario. The best case scenario here would be we remove all these contingencies, we close escrow in 5 days, and there's no other issues that come up either during that 5 days or after the close. There's no unexpected repairs that weren't noted in those inspection reports or defects in the property that either the seller didn't disclose that they knew about or they didn't know about, and defects just happened after the close of escrow. That's the best case scenario. What would be the worst case scenario? Well, one worst case would be during that 5 days of escrow, the buyer, they just changed their mind and they decide they want to cancel the contract. Well, because they've removed all these contingencies, it is going to be a challenge to just cancel the contract and easily get their deposit back. Okay, remember that in the offer, there's an initial deposit amount, and typically it's going to be 3% of the offer amount. So this can add up to tens of thousands of dollars. Let's just say the offer amount was $1 million. Then that initial deposit at 3%, that would be $30,000. And there could be some dispute over returning or releasing that deposit amount back to the buyer out of escrow. I don't want to get into all the potential scenarios that could occur, but there is some risk that the buyer might lose their deposit. There's, of course, other considerations that the seller may have. They may, if the contract is being canceled and the buyer's backing out, they may not want to hold up that deposit because that may prevent them from quickly putting the property back on the market and finding a new buyer. And that could kind of put a dark cloud over the listing and have potential buyers questioning what's wrong with that property. So that's one motivation that the seller may have, not to try and hold up the deposit or try and file a lawsuit to try and gain that deposit. Anyway, that's just a risk that could occur in that worst case scenario. And then the other worst case scenario might be after close of escrow, there's some structural defect, let's say, to the house that either was not disclosed and the seller knew about it, or the seller didn't know about it, but it was just a latent defect. And perhaps during that investigation period, that defect could have been uncovered. Not a guarantee that it would have been uncovered, but because all those contingencies were removed up front, there was no opportunity there. So what it comes down to really is a risk assessment by the buyer as to whether they feel comfortable removing those contingencies and getting in that bidding war, being in a good position to be able to purchase that house. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, is getting the property that really meets your needs, that you feel you could be comfortable with, that your family will be able to enjoy for years to come. That's what I got for you today. And it's important, of course, to have a real estate agent who can kind of walk you through all of the pros and cons and those best case, worst case scenarios and make that assessment. Now, I will tell you that if you got into a situation, if you're a buyer, you got into a situation where the seller was just requiring you to remove all those contingencies up front in order to be competitive, as if you made that decision to make that non-contingent offer, if I were representing you, and of course I'd be having all of those conversations with you on the pros and cons, but at the end of the day, it's going to be your decision. And if you decided to remove all those contingencies, My broker would have you sign a buyer's investigation waiver that would indicate that you are waiving your right to investigate the property during the escrow period. And this would be acting against broker's advice. Kind of a CYA for the real estate agents. But that's the reality of what we're faced with in this highly competitive market with limited inventory. All right, that's what I got for you today. And I'm going to close with my opening video, the most interesting agent in the world. I'm Philip Ma with eXp Realty. Reach out to me if you want to discuss this topic or just in general, buying or selling a home in Silicon Valley. And I hope you enjoy. I hope you have a great weekend.
That's a good question. I'd say, well, let's just put it this way. Agent Philip Ma is one of the most interesting agents in the world.
People hang on his every word, even the prepositions. He could disarm you with his looks or his hands. Either way. He can speak French in Russian. He is the most interesting man in the world.
I don't always drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis.